Welcome. I'm Huck Truesdell of Tide Pool Bookshop. Just about a year ago, my wife Josephine and I began this venture here at 372 Chandler Street. And this evening, we have the pleasure of hosting the Center for Nonviolent Solutions for their launch of the book, True Commitments, a memoir by the late Michael True. Michael's daughter, Betsy, is here in the bookstore, along with Claire Schaefer Duffy of the Center for Nonviolent Solutions. Glad you were able to Zoom in this evening, and please welcome Claire and Betsy.
Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Center for Nonviolent Solutions, welcome. We are a small nonprofit in the city of Worcester that is dedicated to peace education. And while our focus has been primarily on youth programs, we've taken advantage this year of the wide world of Zoom to do public presentations for adults. Some of you have been with us since we began this initiative in January. We had a documentary on nonviolence. We had a retired police captain speak about applying the principles of Kingian nonviolence to his work as a police officer and in retirement. And we had a wonderful exchange with a veteran peace builder working with Americans across political divides, how dialogue is helping to deepen understanding between them. So this evening, very appropriately, we're going to celebrate the memoir written by our beloved friend, Michael True, who was a co-founder of the Center for Nonviolent Solutions. April is Poetry Month. It's also marks the second anniversary of Mike's passing. So it's a suitable month to really think about the life of Mike True. He was a professor of English, a peace scholar, an activist, a father, a grandfather, a man known to many of us in Worcester. He authored 10 books, and we have, just to give you a sense of Mike's prolific life, we have some of them back here, including the one we'll be talking about tonight. He also wrote numerous essays, reviews, and poems that were published in scholarly and general periodicals. He was the founding editor of the literary magazine, the Worcester Review, and co-founder of the Worcester County Poetry Association. A native of Oklahoma, Mike completed his doctorate in American literature at Duke University. Twice a Fulbright scholar, he taught at more than 20 colleges and universities, including Columbia University, Nanjing University, and Utkal University. A former president of the International Peace Research Association, he co-founded the center, and his numerous honors include the 2000 Lifetime Achievement Award from the Peace Studies Association and the 2015 Stanley Kunitz Award from the Worcester County Poetry Association. Those of you who didn't have the privilege of knowing Mike, I must tell you, he was famous for celebrating the achievements of others, upholding nonviolent histories, upholding peace builders. And these many books that he wrote featured the lives and the works of other people. But in this final memoir, he talks a bit about his own life and all the people who crossed and journeyed with him. So I am thrilled to have with me Mike's daughter, Betsy, one of the 6 famous True kids. And she's going to speak to us a little bit about why her dad chose to write a memoir in the final years of his life. Then to whet your appetite, we're going to read some excerpts from the book, True Commitments. And we have joining us in these readings our dear friend David O'Brien. So he's going to, and who knew Mike far longer than I did. And then afterwards, we'll tell you where you can buy the book. So first from Betsy, tell us why your dad decided to write a memoir in the final years of his life.
I just want to say hi to everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. I want to first thank and acknowledge Claire and the Center for Nonviolent Solutions for their continued support in advertising my father's memoir. I clearly remember Claire announcing at the memorial for my father, June 1st, 2019 in Mechanics Hall, how we should look for the memoir in the next year. Also, I want to thank Marcia Gagliardi for meeting with me every other week over a year and working to add photos to the memoir and getting the manuscript ready for publication. I think my father wrote his memoir because he wanted to share what he learned. He was always surprised and grateful for his life. He was always surprised by his good fortune and having a nice home, a successful career, and a large community of friends and family who sought his counsel. I also think he wrote to explore his spiritual journey. His activism, living in North Carolina during the Jim Crow laws, the Vietnam War, the Reagan and Bush administrations, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, was really an extension of his desire to understand the power of nonviolence and reconciliation at a fundamental and personal level. Writing about the different chapters of his life allowed him to reflect on the actions that shaped his relationships. He says at the end of True Commitments, writing my memoir offered me an opportunity to avoid losing people and events that have been informed in my life. My travels, as well as my friends and family, were important in understanding my responses to and encounters with a wide range of people. As my life unfolded, I discovered, in the words of the Neruda poem, not only how many I am, but who I will be being.
Wow. Thank you. So we just ask, before we read the excerpts, if all of us joining us tonight, and it's great, we've got 58 people, this is wonderful. If you can please mute your mics, that we'd so appreciate that. And I neglected to say how thrilled we are to be Zooming, Betsy and I, from Tide Pool Bookshops, which is here on Chandler Street. Mike would love this place. It's just the coolest independent bookstore. So we're not COVID free here, but we are trying to get out in the world, and you got to get out and see this bookshop. So while we read from Mike's memoir, I just wanted to share, if I can do this, please God, some photos to accompany the reading tonight. So let's hope I can do this. Oops. So, Rochelle, are we good? Can people see the screen? Okay. Oklahoma, 1933. Wherever we looked, the land would hold us up. I owe to the Murphys my populist sympathies, as well as genes for good health and my thick Irish neck, the Murphys being Mike's mother's family. After farming near Lockridge and 1 year in western Nebraska, they moved in 1910 to Oklahoma City, where my grandfather owned a team of horses that he hired out to the city. Later, he took a job as janitor at a public elementary school a mile north of the state capitol. I loved visiting his basement office in the boiler room. There we go. Sorry about that. Those are Mike's parents. So we're talking here about his mom's folks. Sitting in his big brown rocking chair and making the rounds with him as he mended fences, fed goldfish, and mowed the lawn surrounding the schoolhouse. He and my grandmother had an oil well in their backyard, which earned them a small pension, only a pittance of the money it must have earned for the British American Oil Company. Until I was 5, we lived at 712 Bell Avenue near the center of town, then moved to an imposing brown-stained 2-story house on a gravel road about a mile from downtown. Our so-called new home had been neglected for years, one reason my parents could afford it. My mother repaired and redecorated the house inside and out and reclaimed the 75 by 150-foot lot around it. Oklahoma summers brought periodic droughts with water rationing. My mother and I carried water in a wash tub to a circular bed of marigolds, rectangular beds of zinnias, rose bushes, and yellow and purple irises near mulberry trees in the side and backyards. My poem commemorates her gardening. Her word. She often talked to flowers. At 72, she commanded bougainvillea into bloom. Oklahoma watched, skeptical, resentful. Taking dust and clay, she willed them into magnolia blossoms, pampered them into violets, saying, "I'm Agnes Murphy, now listen." And they did, profusely. Geraniums, irises, marigolds, even dandelions. So Mike's story began in Lawton, Oklahoma.
Now I'm going to read an excerpt from when he arrives in Worcester.
Oh, no, wait a minute.
No,
Sorry,
I'm not.
not yet. David, we need your, for this photo, we need your excerpt, please.
Sure,
About that.
thank you. When Michael graduated from the University of Oklahoma, he had to choose between University of Wisconsin and University of Minnesota for graduate school, and he chose Minnesota, the state where his father and his father's family, 4 brothers and sisters had been born. So his paternal family were rooted in Minnesota. So he came to the University of Minnesota, and that's the section I'm going to read, in 1955. Having previously visited the university in the city, I arrived at the railroad station in Minneapolis in September 1955 with positive expectations. While serving as a resident counselor in Delta House, I soon discovered that the Newman Center, 2 doors away, was something of a nerve center on campus. Its cafeteria, bookstore, drama group, non-credit seminars, engaging liturgical services, and literary magazine made a lively meeting place. Visiting artists and scholars included J.F. Powers, John Lafarge, S.J., W.H. Auden, John Courtney Murray, S.J., Flannery O'Connor, John Cogley, and John Charlotte, as well as Ellen Tate and John Berryman, who were university faculty who frequented the center. Michael would tell of picking them up at their transportation and guiding them through their stay. So meeting these remarkable people. Father George Geralds, director of the Campus Newman Center and well-known and in great demand in the Twin Cities, was responsible for much of the activity, having recently named a promising young professional by Time magazine. A native of Illinois and diocesan priest, educated at the seminaries of St. Louis and St. Paul, he admired John Henry Newman, the great 19th century Oxford scholar, priest, and literary personality, recognized by many as the spiritual father of Vatican II. George's range of interests and friendships, as well as his genuine connection to students and remarkable talent for liturgy, contributed to his success as a chaplain. Before Vatican II, he implemented liturgical changes with a religious perspective that influenced American Catholicism through the 1980s. I made an effort to get to know him, sometimes taking long walks with him in the evening to get to know him, and at a time when I had his full attention. Although he wrote several books, George was much better known for other talents, including an ability to capture in a single phrase the essence of a literary work, film, or lecture. His imagination and originality led to his later success when, in a parish, he became the refuge of educated and ordinary Catholics throughout the region. Banished from the Newman Center and appointed pastor of St. Francis Cabrini Church in Minneapolis, he attracted many new parishioners and visitors. His popularity inevitably led to the hierarchies regarding him with suspicion. After taking a leave to complete a doctorate at Syracuse University, he left the priesthood and married. The move was a common story among other talented priests as the institutional church moved away from the promise of the Second Vatican Council. Afterwards, George made the most of his gifts as a chaplain at Rensselaer Polytechnic in Troy, New York, and professor at Mercyhurst College in Erie, Pennsylvania. I learned much from George about religion, literature, and how to conduct myself as a teacher and community organizer beyond the classroom. Our friendship over 50 years is one of the gifts of my life. And I should add that when George married, Michael brought him to Worcester and shared him with us for a few years. And if we had time, we would have some remarkable stories about our time with George. He was really a remarkable person.
Okay, now I'm going to speak about Massachusetts. He begins this chapter, Massachusetts, 1965. As if I were sent so that whatever takes place has meaning because it changes into memory. That was by Czesław Miłosz. Although a modest college of 400 male undergraduates, Assumption values teaching. The students wrote competently and appreciate literature and the humanities. Founded in 1905 by the Roman Catholic monastic order, Augustinians of the Assumption, the college had links to the French Canadian community. When I arrived on campus, Assumptionists had embraced the spirit of Vatican II and policies associated with it, thus accompanying a fruitful period for Catholic culture, however parochial in some ways. Well-educated clergy knew about European theologians and intellectuals. American writers such as Robert Lowell, Flannery O'Connor, and Mary McCarthy made valuable use of their Catholic experience, even in criticizing it. In a high point of my first year, I joined Robert Fitzgerald, Boylston Professor of Rhetoric at Harvard and O'Connor's friend, on Boston's public television, Channel 2, WGBH, to review Everything That Rises Must Converge, her collection of short stories. Sally Fitzgerald, Robert's wife and editor of O'Connor's letters, later lectured at Assumption and stayed with us for several days during a winter storm. While the early years in Worcester proved strenuous for me at Assumption and with various anti-war projects, Mary Pat stayed at home with our young children. She shepherded them to the grade school just 2 blocks away. She made lunches and dinners and took the kids grocery shopping, to secondhand stores and out to lunch at Friendly's or Newport Creamery. I give her a lot of credit in keeping the household together. Mary Pat developed friendships easily, and her friends often came by for visits. Later, she would go to lunch and dinner with coworkers from the Worcester Public Schools Child Psychology Department and Worcester Children's Friends Society. She'd always been a good conversationalist and comes from a long line of Irish American storytellers. Mary Pat loves to engage with people, and what begins as, "How are you doing?" becomes a longer chat about where someone grew up and how many children they have. Mary Pat has a gift of a casual detective. She is truly interested in other people's lives and their histories. Mary Pat welcomes so many guests, visiting poets and writers to stay overnight on our 3rd floor.
So in the Worcester chapter, those of you who are from the city and those who aren't, you'll just find it fascinating how many people were in and out of the True home with those 6 kids, the wonderful Mary Pat and Mike trying to teach and also write. So David's going to give us, we're going to give you a couple of flavors from his intersection with activists as well as literary poets, because the household was really a train station of major American poets and activists. So David, if you want to read one, and then I'll read one.
In Worcester on Friday nights, the Phoenix, a political forum, sponsored well-known speakers on civil rights and foreign policy and on ecclesiastical and liturgical reforms associated with Vatican II. People gathered at a storefront at 65.5 Main Street to hear faculty from nearby colleges and universities, from the American Friends Service Committee, the War Resisters League. Abby Hoffman, a Worcester native active at the Phoenix, had already established a local reputation for his talent at street theater. Before an audience of right-wing politicos at Worcester Public Library, Abby had unfurled a wide banner that read in large letters, Fuck Communism. After studying at Brandeis University and the University of California at Berkeley and working as a medical supply salesman at the time, he opened a SNCC shop for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee next door to the Phoenix, SNCC. The SNCC shop sold handicrafts from Mississippi to benefit voter registration there. Abby's local compatriots included Father Bernard Gilgun, a diocesan priest active in the civil rights movement, and local chaplain, later chaplain to Worcester's Mustard Seed Catholic Worker. Eventually, in the late 60s, Abby left for New York and national fame.
So Mike, in his opposition to the Vietnam War, did a lot of work on draft counseling. He also participated in civil disobedience, not just in opposition to that war, but Scott and I knew him with regard to nuclear weapons. So here's his recollection of joining a sit-in that had been organized April 1970 by a Clark student. Michael writes that it was according to strict Gandhian principles. We gathered at 5:30 a.m. on April 4, 1970, a block from the draft board in downtown Worcester, and walked nervously to the office on the 6th floor, where we sat down and waited for federal employees to arrive for work. On the street below, with observers from the American Civil Liberties Union, friends passed out leaflets explaining what we did and why. Police arrived, first of all to warn and then to arrest us. My doggerel verse at the time described what happened next. Tired people watched as the kind police apologized their way to jail and carried 12 bodies 7 flights down, some male and some female. After that, a paddy wagon took us to the Worcester County Jail and House of Correction in West Boylston, a few blocks from the arrest. Imprisonment, I wrote to my students, is a pretty fast education for a petty bourgeois, the food greasy and the routine deadening, the place filled with young people who were like their counterparts on the outside. Fun to talk to. Going to Sunday Mass at the jail was something of a revelation as well. The priest, regarded by inmates as a religious screw, gave sermons on obeying the law. Quote, "People on the outside have done far worse than you," he said, "but the one difference between them and you is that they're smarter. They didn't get caught." And here's something of Mike's recollection about the numerous poets that he brought to Worcester, really putting the city on the map through the Worcester Poetry Association as a significant place. Arranging readings and providing hospitality for poets and writers over the years influenced my teaching, writing, and my public and private life. Certain encounters remain vivid in memory. Joseph Brodsky reading poems in Russian, then giving my colleague Tom Bukowski a bakalaika made by students from his native country, Adrian Rich at our dining room table, signing an early collection shortly before receiving the Pulitzer Prize for diving into the wreck, William Stafford wearing my son's cowboy boots too large for him and traipsing through 2 feet of snow to a coffee shop near our house, Robert Bly in our entryway, surrounded by groupies, spinning around to show his Mexican serape, Dennis Levertov raising her fist, acknowledging the cheers at a huge Clark University auditorium at the time of Kent State, and riding a small scooter across campus. She lent the scooter to our son, Christopher. Similar flashbacks from that period, resembling film, moving fast forward, including Daniel Berrigan arriving at Holy Cross and pointing to a row of vacant chairs. "I see a number of Jesuit brothers are here," he said.
Next, I'm going to read about his arrival in England when he was 45. This was his first trip abroad, and he often visited Charney Manor, a Quaker retreat center when he went to England. 13th century Charney Manor, a Society of Friends conference center, became a place of pilgrimage after 1979. Arriving at Heathrow, I took a bus and then a train to Reading and Didcot, traveling north through picturesque villages and winding hedgerows near the Vale of the White Horse to Charney Bassett, Oxfordshire. The manor had once belonged to a great Abingdon monastery before it had plundered by Henry VIII. The stone wall contains the garden at the back of the retreat center, its front and back entrances smothered in hawthorn and wisteria in bloom. From an upstairs window, one looks towards the stone bridge, an occasional rider on horseback passing over, and a pub only 2 blocks away. After an annual conference of the International Peace Research Association in Groningen, the Netherlands, my wife and I made our way back to England. Following several days at The Hague, among exhibits of paintings from Rembrandt, Vermeer, Rubens, and Bruegel, before going on to Delft, the Hook of Holland, we then crossed the North Sea to Delft. Our destination on the trip was Durham, where we spent a week in the university dorm in the shadow of the magnificent Durham Cathedral, with breakfast in the palace's great hall and delicious scones and tea at the almshouse. In the cool evenings, beneath the blue-gray sky, in the shadow of the silent cathedral, people strolled up the footpath from the river bridge and along the palace green. They were middle class and elderly, husbands and wives, young couples with children, widows with daughters in short skirts, and punk rock youngins with pink and orange hair and leather belts. Amid the abundant flower beds and beneath the spires and thick tower of St. Cuthbert, empire asserted itself in war memorials and heraldry from centuries before. Almost inevitably, I felt myself wondering how many of my ancestors from the region died hoisting heavy stones on stone for their daily bread and building those great monuments.
So Mike, who began in Lawton, Oklahoma, and didn't leave this country until his late 40s, found in when he was in his 50s and 60s and even 70s, I think, doing a considerable amount of international travel, primarily as a peace scholar, and on 2 occasions at least through Fulbright grant. His trip to China was through Fulbright, but it was American literature, not peace scholarship. He happened to be in China during the Tiananmen Square uprising in 1989. He was both an observer. He was in Nanjing, but later kind of became an interpreter somewhat of that event, because he wrote a very strong essay about the nonviolent efforts of the students. And it's really important because the history of Tiananmen Square, as many of you know, the Chinese government worked hard to repress it, and what actually happened, what occurred. And in his memoir, you can get a glimpse of that history, under-recorded history, as seen by an American literature professor with an enormous heart and an eye for nonviolent activism. Supplicant, so here's an excerpt from that chapter. Supplicant, initially student protesters carried enough about their country to call their elders to account on matters that affected everyone: censorship, nepotism, and corruption. For many Chinese, the uprising resonated with the May 4th movement 1919, when an earlier generation of students called their elders to account, and in a movement that led to the birth of modern China. This time, they made every effort not to isolate themselves from townspeople and workers who regard them as an elite, which of course they are. Older people recognized nonetheless that students reflected their own dissatisfaction with the party's central committee of old men who had lost touch with the younger generation. In Beijing, students from major universities in Beijing occupied Tiananmen Square, where some of them began a fast, refusing water until foreign journalists warned them against doing so. In a movement that was basically nationalistic, student leaders knelt before government officials at the edge of the huge square with long signed petitions advocating freedom of the press. Disregarded and told to disperse, the disciplined crowd became more militant, even defiant, knowing that even some party members supported them. Each morning in Nanjing, students gathered at the university gate and walked to historic Gulu Square for a day-long assembly to be joined by others for speeches and protests. Along the sidewalks, people applauded students who formed a cordon around the demonstrators to prevent anyone from disrupting their purposeful march. Standing on the sidelines, so as not to be accused of being an outside agitator, I was deeply impressed by the young people's sophistication in conducting a nonviolent movement, though apprehensive at the same time about what might happen to them. Among Mike's travels were his trips to India, and he made at least 4. And they came, the first one at a time of immediately after his retirement or shortly from Assumption. And the trip was not only intellectually valuable for him, but enormously valuable spiritually. And I think Betsy spoke about Mike's life taking seriously the spiritual path. He began very much as a Catholic and died a Catholic, but on the way exchanged with so many great traditions with deep curiosity. And I'll just read a final section, and then I think that's all we have in readings. This is our first effort at a virtual book launch or any book launch. So give me a minute and I will see. This follows an entry written within days of arriving in India, and the immersion awakens feelings of struggle within him that he had had working as a professor at Assumption, a professor that was trying to implement peace and conflict studies and a view of, the Catholic faith that was challenged often. So he acknowledges in this journal entry that it's been a hard time for him. The morning after writing that entry, I woke feeling that everything would be fine. The first such awakening in months. The window of my second floor hotel room looked down at a compound next door with corrugated metal roof, a palm tree. Sorry about this, everybody. Hold on. I have an India picture for you. And tropical plants in bloom. In the early morning, men, women, and adolescents wrapped in sarongs stood in line, then under a cold water spigot. In a shaded corner nearby, others poured water from a tin tub over themselves or waded in the open, a towel over her shoulders. The compound just off the busy 2-lane, second busiest thoroughfare in the country is home to 20 people busy with washing clothes and preparing meals, the children at play. A morning haze slowly gives way to sunny weather, though dustier throughout the day until evening. After breakfast on my way to the campus, I walked along the busy highway to catch a ramshackle, rusty yellow bus as school children in uniforms filled the metal 2-seaters on either side of the aisle. The driver struggled with the long bent gear shift as he maneuvered through heavy traffic, huge trucks, buses, motorcycles, weaving from one lane to another at the whim of the driver, trying to avoid occasional cows or goats. I sat on the side opposite the highway since it looked as if we were in imminent danger of colliding with vehicles coming toward us. Along the way, families living in small, low tents without electricity or other amenities gathered around leaky waters to bathe, to wash their clothes. So he goes on and makes a poetic reference there later in his vivid description of being in India, a country of deep transformation for him. So that is what we have for you in excerpts. I think David maybe had another one that he wanted to read, and then we want to be sure you know how you can get this wonderful memoir. So David, did you have another one that you wanted to read?
It's a little bit out of sync with the earlier one, but I just wanted the one about Mary Pet. Near the end of my first year at the University of Minnesota, in a seminar on the Jesuit poet Gerard Manley Hopkins at the Newman Center, I met Mary Pat Delaney, a friend of several women in my graduate class. Shortly afterwards, we attended a costume party at the fraternity house and spoke several times on the phone. When I invited her to accompany me to the Eliot lecture, the Eliot lecture by T.S. Eliot, however, she turned me down. If she had had a bad time on the first date, she added, she would have accepted. But since she had a good time, and because she had plans to enter the convent of the Sisters of the Visitation, she had to say no. 9 months later, at the first word of her leaving the convent, I phoned her for a date, and we went out dancing to the St. Paul Hotel the following weekend. During the winter, I rode the University Avenue bus to St. Paul, walked a mile in the bitter cold to her family home on Portland Avenue. Fortunately for me, she agreed to type my 3 research papers required for the master's degree. A year later, after my time in the Army, we were married at St. Luke's Church, just a block from her home.
Thank you. That's such a great, great section. So I made a bit of an error here, but I think I can self-correct. There are many ways that you can get true commitments. If you're in Worcester, do come in the shop. Joe and Huck Truesdale would love to see you. You can buy it the good old-fashioned way. There are copies of the book here. You can also order it online through Tide Pool Bookshop, but Huck is reminding me that the actual price of the book, which is I think $22.95, is not clear on Tide Pool Bookshop's website. You can also write to us at the St. Francis, Scott and myself at St. Francis and Therese Catholic Worker, and I've given the snail mail address there. Or you can order through True Commitments. So please get Mike's book. You will just realize what a joyous life looks like. You'll take it, we need more examples of a joyous life coming out of the hard year of COVID, but the extraordinary arc of Mike's life and how following one's curiosity and commitments to peace, far from being onerous, far from being a drudge, is quite, makes us more human. I don't know if people had questions or comments. I'm just going to try to figure out how to stop sharing here. So if you have questions or comments, you can put them in the chat box, but we just really wanted to encourage you to get the book.
Well, while you're putting them in the chat box, just a note on keeping a journal. I don't know if any of us knew. I certainly didn't know that Mike kept this journal throughout a lifetime. And I sometimes, in very tedious talks, tell my children and grandchildren they should keep a journal. And here's a good example of why. In later years, he was able to recall so many details of his experience and the names of all those people that he knew and encountered over the years. It's a wonderful example of the value of keeping a journal.
Yes.
David, this is John True. David, thank you. That was a great comment. The Betsy at the tide pool there is also a very keen diary keeper, and she also shares something else with my dad, which is an incredible memory relative to dates, times, and people. So she has those tools. So it's not surprising that she was the led on this book, because a lot of the tools that my dad had are exactly the tools that Betsy has, which I, as I said, is the journaling and the diary, but also an incredible memory for dates, birthdays, names, etc.
Thank you, John. This is Ann True.
Wait, did you say something?
You can, okay, I guess I can be on video too. Oh, hello. Thank you, David, for bringing up the journals. I'm work in a public school, and I was telling second graders it's really good to keep a diary because my father wrote a book, and as you said, relied on that. What I was going to say is I joined my father in China for 6 months with my brother Chris, and I also visited him in India, and he was also at the University of Hawaii. And I was amazed. I love to watch him because he was unbelievably flexible with traveling. He could sleep anywhere. He was so enthusiastic about anywhere he went. The people he met, he would rave about his encounters, and it's always good to think about him because he was so optimistic, despite what things going around, including protests where, you know, he would as it says in the book, and my brother Mike has told the story, where he would be sometimes the only one on protesting, and people would drive by and give him their middle finger and honk at him and swear at him. And he'd just wave. He's just like, his persistence and I was going to say commitment, back to the title of the book. But it's amazing how many people he met, and also the writers, which is a real inspiration. If you look back at the number of people that he contacted and pursued, and he just persisted with keeping in touch with people all over the world. I'll leave it there. Nice to see everyone.
And I'm going to jump in if I can with another True, if it's going to let me. I don't know.
We hear you.
Am I on? Can I say something?
You're on.
Okay, great. What amazes me, a lot of the stuff reading the book, and I'm not a big reader, but reading the book and the different things I found out that wasn't aware of, going through different papers and all. I was recently going through a paper, and I just wanted to share this. It was the quick thing somebody wrote up called A True Story. It was 1969, my first year teaching at Assumption College, when Mike True entered my life. I was on a field trip to the Worcester County Jail on Summer Street with an undergraduate class. As the students walked through this dark and dismal place, large steel doors clanging ominously behind them, I could sense their fear and apprehension. While being escorted through the while being escorted through the cell block by several burly guards, a hand reaches out from one of the cells and thrusts a note into my hand. I was stunned, but quickly shoved it in my pants, hoping that the guards didn't see what happened. Once outside in the safety of my car, I opened the note. It read, what can we do educationally to help these inmates? The level of illiteracy among them is extremely high. They don't stand a chance without some form of education. Signed, Mike True. He had been arrested, anti-war protest. He was much more concerned with his fellow man than his own situation. If anyone exemplifies the gospel messages of love thy neighbor, It's Mike. And what happened then was this guy went back to the school committee and they started a program with the Worcester Public Schools to educate in jail. Interesting though, when interviewed about my dad being in jail, this experience, other than the burly guards and some of the large steel doors, my mother's description of the atmosphere of our house with 6 kids raising hell, all under the age of 10, it sounded very similar to the jail description and the story there. My mom had a great sense of humor about it. It was a great way to grow up, very interesting and loving home. My mom actually, during this, I mentioned this before, when he was in jail, the TV reporters came out and talked to my mother and said, what do you think about this here? Your husband, Dr. True, being willing to, spend some time in jail for standing up what he believes in. And my mom, without batting an eye, quickly responded, hey, look, there's 6 kids under the age of 10 here at home. When he gets out and he's done with his vacation, I'm taking mine. So they were a great team, and it's amazing. The more I pick up these papers, the stuff that he did is unbelievable. He was a great, great father too. Thank you.
Michael, Claire and I were honored to be asked to write the introductions to this book. And your father was one of the few people who ever visited Claire and me at the Catholic Worker in Washington, D.C. Our neighborhood in Washington, D.C. was very, very, very tough. Michael came down in his suit and tie and stayed at our house and gave a talk. He was so comfortable. And I remember years later seeing him be arrested with me again, so comfortable in court. And then even in India at a Jain conference, which I attended with him, he seemed perfectly comfortable there too. It's just extraordinary. And I really recommend everyone go to the Tidepool Bookshop on Chandler Street, buy a book, read this book, then go buy another one and go across the street to the post office and send it to a friend of yours, because Michael really needs to be remembered and treasured, and the experiences he had can encourage all of us to take risks and have fuller lives too.
All right, another True has to speak. Sorry, once one starts, we all get going. This is Mary Laurel, and I just want to say to also support Scott and Claire and the Center for Nonviolent Solutions and the staff, the wonderful people that work there, because without their work, we wouldn't have the lecture, that's done every year. We wouldn't have probably this book, this book launch. We wouldn't have so much of the work that my father wanted to carry on. And so if people have some donations, that, please think about that, because their work, not only at the Catholic Worker there, but also the Center for Nonviolent Solutions, is really something, to support. And I just want to mention, I see my colleague, Sarah Degner Rivero, who also has 5 children and teaches in prison and does the great work of teaching Spanish and carrying on this work. So I just want to say there's a great woman and a lot of great people. But when we're talking about the prisons, and also she's a wonderful poet too. But anyway, so thank you so much, Betsy. You really pulled it together with the book and now with this for us. And we all appreciate you. And Scott and Claire and Marcia, oh my gosh, this book wouldn't exist without her dedication. She's been working so hard for so long. And so let's continue this. Maybe once a year, we'll have a Zoom call about some more stories and, anyway, I'll stop. But I also wanted to mention my dad was also a great grandfather, not just a grandfather. So the great grandchildren are represented too, and a lot of
Yes,
wonderful.
thank you for pointing that out.
Yes.
Extremely delighted great-grandfather, because I remember when a couple of those babies arrived, hearing about them at board meetings at the center. So just ecstatic about the new life coming into the family. Thanks, Mary Laurel.
And thanks to all the great peace people that are continuing the work all around the country. I see KK and Jim. I can't see everybody, but I know they're working. There's so many great people.
So Tide Pool Bookshops to buy in person, and or you can get it online through Tide Pool Books, or Tide Pool Bookshop, I should say, or through True Commitments, or order it from the Catholic Worker. Do you have a closing word, David, or do you have a closing word, Betsy? We're almost at our hour.
Thank you, everybody, to all of you for keeping alive the memory of Mike and all he's done. And God bless you.
Thank you, Dave, again, for all that you've done for all of us and the family, and Scott and Claire and everybody else. Thank you very much for everything.
Thanks, David.
All right, so we'll have one more event in May. Join us at the center for another Zoom presentation on active nonviolence. And this event is recorded. So a couple of people, Diane Fox of Holy Cross, wanted to hear about Mike's book. So if you know people who couldn't make it tonight and wanted to learn about True Commitments, we will be sending out the recording. But many thanks for joining us. Tide Pool Bookshop, everybody. True Commitments. Finish up.
And my dad would go like this when he was really happy. So
Yes.
we'll all go like this. Woohoo! And he'd say, let's go for a drink now. Let's have happy hour. So
Exactly.
anyway,
That was the one lacking prop was going to be the alcohol.
yay.
A nice glass of wine. All right. Take care. And many thanks to Tide
Okay,
Pool
Bye,
Bookshop.
everybody.
Bye.
Who are on the road must have a code that you can live by, and so become yourself, because the past is just a goodbye. Teach your children well, their father's hell did slowly go by, and feed them on your dreams, the one they picked, the one you know by. Don't you ever ask them why, if they told you you would cry, so just look at them and sigh. They love you. And you of tender years can't know the fears that your elders grew by, and so please help them with your youth. They see the truth before they can die. Teach your parents well, their children's hell will slowly go by, and feed them on your dreams, the one they picked, the one you know by. Don't you ever ask them why, if they told you you would cry, so just look at them and sigh.